What I'm going to do this morning is share with you for about half an hour the key points that I've been invited to talk about, which is particularly the experiences of LGBTI people with dementia, and also to the work that I'm doing around kindness and the intersections with dementia there as well. But before I do that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I have been doing, about the Celebrate Aging, about the work that I do broadly, but particularly about the work that I'm doing around recognition of the human experience of living with dementia. So I want to share that with you. It's about half an hour, and I mostly have, in my PowerPoint presentation, it's mostly photographs. So the work that I do takes mostly an art and narrative-based approach to sharing evidence with the community to try and create real social change. So it means that when I deliver a presentation, I've got lots of gorgeous photographs, which is absolutely fantastic. So today I was trying to think of the thread between kindness and queerness, if you like, or LGBTIQ people. So rainbows and kindness. And I thought because that would seem fluffy to some people, I wanted to really particularly position this as something that is human and evidence-based. And I think that we don't often think of the two as being connected. I feel sometimes like evidence is seen as being about the physiological aspects of dementia, but I'm really interested in evidence about human experiences. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But just to give you a little bit of a background about the work that I do, I started my professional career as a nurse working mostly in residential aged care and really love working with older people. And that was about 20 years. And then I went across to academia and did work particularly around sexuality and aging. And what I noticed with the work that I was doing in academia is that I was doing incredibly important research work, but it wasn't translating into cultural change. So I decided to set up Celebrate Aging, which is a not-for-profit and hopefully soon a charity, that is challenging ageism and building respect for older people. And I've been doing this for 5 years. And as I said before, art and narrative-based approaches to trying to create real cultural change. Now, I want to acknowledge that I understand that dementia is not just a disease of older people. I understand that younger people have dementia as well too, but I'm making that connection between the work that I do with older people and the work that I do around the lives of people with dementia. And Kate and I were talking earlier on about the impact of ageism on the experiences of people with dementia. And I think that ageism really is a problem for people with dementia because dementia is seen as a disease of older people, and older people don't matter by and large in Australia. And I understand it to be similar in other parts of the world, with the exception in Australia of in Aboriginal communities. And there's the most heartwarming respect for older people. So what I've done throughout this presentation, if you see on this slide down the bottom on the right, celebrateaging.com, there'll be web links all the way through this presentation, so you can go back and have a look at any of the resources or information that I'm sharing with you. But if you can see across the top of the screen, Celebrate Aging has a number of programs, and I want to share a couple of those programs with you now. And starting with one of the programs that I set up called the Museum of Love. And this is a program that I set up because of the concerns that I had around the dehumanizing of the experiences of people living with dementia. And what I noticed was, people that I knew with dementia telling me that there is a tendency to focus on their lives as being just about the disease that was happening in their brain rather than the whole experience, their whole human experience. And what I also noticed was that, if I did a search on the internet for images of people with dementia, it was often people looking angst-ridden or metaphors for a diseased brain. So it might be a picture of a tree with the leaves blowing off it. And so what I got from all of that and my conversations with people with dementia and their families was not that was not part of a reality, that suffering and disease is part of living with dementia, but people also wanted to be seen as fully human. They wanted full citizenship. They wanted to be acknowledged as people living with dementia. That was the message that I was receiving. And so I decided to do that through this program called the Museum of Love. And what the Museum of Love does is it develops, collects and preserves art that celebrates the importance of love in the lives of people with dementia. So it's a beautiful collection of online exhibitions. Hopefully one day we might even have a physical building. But there is a kind of an assumption underpinning these collections that people with dementia are human, are capable of love, are loving, love life, and you cannot look at this exhibition without understanding people with dementia as fully human. So what I want to do is just share with you a couple of the exhibitions that are part of the Museum of Love. So this first exhibition, and this is probably the most famous or widely known, is a series of portraits of people with dementia kissing someone they love. And can I acknowledge that Glenys and John are here in the webinar this morning. So this portrait by Lisa White. And one of the things about these portraits of people with dementia and people that they love, you know, sharing a hug and a kiss, is that people often say to me, but I can't tell which one has dementia. And I say, well, actually, that's the point, that this is not a portrait of dementia. It's a portrait of two human beings. One of them has dementia. It's a portrait of love. And the idea is about celebrating that love in the lives of people with dementia. The next collection is called The Mirror. And this is home snaps from people with dementia doing something that they love. So it can be fishing or eating ice cream or knitting or doing things that they love in a way to create an online gallery that gives hope to people with dementia. So that people with dementia or their families do a search on the internet, they might come up with these images that reflect another aspect of the lives of people with dementia. You know, in addition to, you know, scans of brains and MRI images, that they might see people with dementia enjoying their lives. Dance is a collection of stories from workshops that we host around the importance of belonging in the lives of people with dementia. And the workshops, we actually get up and dance. And it's a great way of getting people thinking about how important it is, unless you're a very confident dancer, to dance solo, how important it is, that collective experience, that when people get up and move, they might feel more confident moving as a collective. And so we do those workshops and then invite people with dementia to talk about the importance of belonging in their lives and what facilitates belonging and what is a barrier to it. And it's some really powerful stories on that page. I want to acknowledge Anne Tudor is in the room. And I also want to acknowledge that beautiful Edie Mayhew isn't with us now. Anne and Edie have done such a lot globally to raise awareness of the importance of love in the lives of people living with dementia. And the Museum of Love has a campaign called Pulse of My Heart, and we tried to document a film. Most years, I think we have 4 films recording Anne and Edie's experience of living with dementia. And Anne has gone on to do amazing work in Ballarat, a town out of Melbourne with about 100,000 people. Anne is doing amazing work creating a dementia-friendly city in Ballarat, building on the approach of Bigger Hearts, that, you know, reaching out and understanding the human experience of living with dementia. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the Pulse of My Heart page on the Museum of Love website and have a look at Anne and Edie's work. Also to the Bigger Hearts page as well. A project that fell out of Anne and Edie's work is the Letters of Love and Dementia campaign. So one of the films that we did with Anne and Edie wrote each other a love letter every day for a week and then opened the letters and read them to each other on film. And it's an incredibly moving, powerful film. And what we did as part of that film, or in the follow-up from that film, is we invited people to write a letter to a person with dementia that they love, or invited a person with dementia to write stories and share their stories with us. And so there's a webpage, Letters of Love and Dementia. And what this campaign does is it really celebrates the humanness and the first person narrative, the human experience of loving someone with dementia or living with dementia. And it's a very powerful one indeed. Probably at the heart of the Museum of Love is a campaign called Small Acts of Love. And this is a concept that came from, an extraordinary academic in Perth called Anne Zubrick. And Anne talks about the small acts of love being a response by people with dementia and their families to some of the challenges in intimate relationships when someone has dementia. And so what we do as part of our workshops is invite people to acknowledge what is difficult, what are the challenges, and then to tell us about what it is that they do to address those challenges. And that is what we call the small acts of love. And we use the rose tattoo as a metaphor for that. And it seemed to really powerfully resonate with people with dementia and their families. The beautiful rose, which is love in the lives of people with dementia, the incredible importance of love, but also noting that the rose has thorns, that there is stuff that's tough, and the importance of acknowledging that. One of the things that we did before COVID was we set up love fests, or festivals of love and dementia. So this collection of activities that is part of the Museum of Love. We had a pilot in Ballarat where we hosted a local festival, and then a full festival in Perth, where we took these activities to Perth and Ballarat, and we invited local people to share local stories. We engaged local media, and we worked at building capacity in a local community. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at the Love Fest Perth collection. It's a beautiful collection of stories and exhibits about love for people in Perth. And before we move away from the Museum of Love, I want to stop for a minute just to celebrate. This feels like a small revolution. Earlier on, we were talking about academics, and somebody who was online was saying, I'm holding academics to account for being relevant and accessible. And I think that's a really important ask. Probably about 2 years ago, I was invited to contribute a chapter for the International Handbook of Love on dementia and love. And one of the first things that I did was contact John Quinn, Glenys Petrie and Anne Tudor, who are all here today, and ask them whether they would co-author the chapter with me. I think it's incredibly important that in an academic volume like this, that if there is a chapter on dementia and love, that it is co-authored by a person with dementia and families of people living with dementia, to make sure that it's real. That's a real challenge, I think, for in some academic context, to acknowledge that people with lived experience have something worthwhile to contribute. But I'm delighted to say that this is probably about 2 months off being launched. And so I think there is this lovely synergy here between the lived experience and the humanness and an evidence base. We've created an evidence base by writing that up as a chapter. So I'm incredibly proud of that work. The next piece of work that I want to share with you is some work that I'm doing around the sexual assault of older women. And this is a topic that is not talked about often in the context of dementia. and that is part of the problem. One of the things that we've had a Royal Commission recently here into aged care, and the Royal Commission identified that there are around 50 sexual assaults occurring in residential aged care homes in Australia every week. That would be an underestimate. And one of the things that is not being acknowledged is that women with dementia are being targeted. That is not a comfortable truth, and we don't talk about it. The fact that we don't talk about it means it is able to continue. We need to talk about this. We need to acknowledge it because it is not going to go away until we talk about it. There is a myth that dementia is a protective factor against sexual assault. There is a myth that age is a protective factor against sexual assault. Neither of them are the case. Having a conversation, being aware, holding service providers to account is a protective factor against sexual assault. And this is Margarita Solis, who was 95 when she was sexually assaulted, and she has started the ball rolling in terms of creating awareness of change. And I don't share this, you know, I'm really mindful that in sharing this, there would be some people who would prefer not to hear about this. I understand that, but let me tell you, by having this conversation, we are preventing sexual assault from happening. I've set up a project called the Power Project. There's a web link address there, and we are about to roll out a national program of education for service providers. And this issue will be addressed. This issue will stop because we are having these conversations. To come to the two topics that I've been invited to talk to you about, the first one that I want to talk to you about is rainbows and dementia, or the experiences of LGBTI people living with dementia. I'm going to be drawing on the research work that I've been involved in, but I want to acknowledge the research that I've been involved in. We've been able to recruit gay and lesbian people living with dementia and trans and gender diverse people. We know very little at this point in Australia about the experiences of bisexual and intersex people living with dementia. Most of this work that you'll see is up on the Alice's Garage website. And what I want to do is position a couple of underpinning facts around the experiences of LGBTI people with dementia. I did some work a number of years ago on a project called We Are Still Gay. This was the name of the research project. This work came from a dementia conference, a national dementia conference in Australia. There was a dementia expert who stood up delivering a plenary session and said, for those of you who are in the room who are LGBTI, you need to know that if you get dementia, you will become straight, you'll revert to the gender assigned at birth. And that was taken by a lot of people in the room as a given. And for me, sitting there listening to that, I knew in my gut that it wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true. I also knew that I needed to prove it, that it wasn't going to be that you know, an argy-bargy conversation, it can't be true, was not going to work. What we needed was an evidence base to refute that as an assumption. So what we did was we got funded, which was, you know, absolutely terrific. And we conducted a series of interviews around the country. And in this case, we were only able to interview lesbian and gay couples. And one of the first questions we said to them, people living with dementia, are you still gay? Are you still lesbian? And almost exclusively the gay men said, naturally, we are still gay. But some of the other beautiful comments were about, I think, Anne, you articulated, you know, our sexuality is not a rinse colour you put through your hair. You know, this idea that it's not. Oh, okay. Okay? I can hear some noises. Is everyone okay? It may be just somebody who doesn't have on mute. And what I want to do is summarise the experiences or our findings in that research could be summarised in one statement. Kate, I think someone might have their computer's not on mute.
I'm just trying to get people to mute. Please, would everyone mute? And it is set up that everyone should be muted when they join, but that seems to not be working.
Seems to have stopped now.
Yep, I did mute a couple, so hopefully that works.
Yeah, terrific. To summarise the findings of this research, I think it's really important to understand, as William Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it is not even past. And this really encapsulates, I guess, a need to understand the historical experiences. And so I can speak from the Australian context, but I imagine it is quite similar in other countries around the world as well too, that now at this point in Australia, most of the legislation has been changed so that LGBT people have legislative equality. So equality is getting closer and closer and closer, but the historical remnants of the pathologizing of LGBTI people are still very much here. And so if we think about older lesbian and gay people who may have dementia, they may have grown up most of their lives knowing that their sexuality or their gender identity could mean that they could be incarcerated, they could be put in jail, or they could also be, you know, in the case some of you may know the work that I've done with Malloy, and Malloy was given shock treatment. She was given a whole range of treatments in the early 60s to try and cure her of her sexuality. So that's a really important context for understanding the experiences of LGBTI people with dementia, because the legacy of that history are still here with us. And when I say the legacies of history, what I mean in particular is that for LGBTI people, there is still, for many, there is still a fear of discrimination, that service providers and the broader community will discriminate in services themselves for people who have grown up understanding that understanding LGBTI people as mad or bad. There can still be that legacy for them that there is still something not quite right with LGBTI people. And often we'll hear people say, I've got nothing against the gays, but, and so there's kind of a limit to a sense of equality. And then the other challenge is in the interaction with families as well too. In a lot of the research that I've been involved in, we've had older lesbians and gay men who understood their sexuality to be against the law or considered to be a madness. And so a number that entered heterosexual marriages and then over time, you know, recognised their sexuality and have, you know, left a heterosexual marriage and entered into same-sex relationships. So all of this is really important context for understanding the experiences of LGBTI people with dementia. You know, the fact that there are these legacies, that the fear is still there, and that there are lifetime patterns for LGBTI people of being concerned about the perspectives of others. And the fact that service providers also grew up in that era and may also have some of those homophobic or transphobic values and beliefs. So I'm going to show you some of the research that I've been involved in and some of the findings. So this research is in relation to lesbians and gay men, and then I'll show you the research in relation to trans and gender diverse people. So this research, the We Are Still Gay, and the other piece of research that was incredibly pivotal here is some research on LGBTI people's experiences of being a carer or being cared for. And what we found across those two research projects is that LGBTI people with dementia delaying access to services they need because of the fear of discrimination in services. So that was one of the issues that came across, and people trying to manage at home at you know, beyond their capacity to do so because they were really frightened of discrimination in services. one of the other issues that came up on a number of occasions as well too was the importance of carer support groups for people with, for the families of people with dementia, but some people feeling that those services were not going to be inclusive, and that was something that they avoided as well too. Or some people had very positive experiences, and others tried and it didn't work for them. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. One of the things that we have done, particularly in Australia, is in relation to LGBTI people with dementia, we've focused on service providers and the difficulties that LGBTI people experience in services. And we are missing, up until this point, largely missing the difficulties people are experiencing with their own families. And that's particularly the case for trans and gender diverse people. But this needs to be understood. We have a real focus here on elder abuse in this country, but we are not picking up the disrespect for LGBTI people's identities, relationships and bodies that is being experienced by people with dementia. So there's some of the issues that are happening for people with dementia, and the disrespect is going all the way through to what we're calling posthumous abuse. So, and I'll share some stories of that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I'm going to put that. So this is from one of the research projects. This is from the Still Gay research. So this is Gavin and his partner Richard, who had dementia. And Gavin said, I'm not a member of any carers groups. I did go to one, but felt like a fish out of water because a lot of them were heterosexual couples. If it came up, I'd say, my partner, and they'd say, oh, how's she? And I'd say, no, he. You know, you're making the assumption and I'm correcting you. And if you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine. Deal with it. I just thought this isn't for me. And so I think looking at this experience, some people might look at this and say, well, Gavin just needs to get on with it and just tell people that his partner's a man and just educate them and get on with it. But the point I was trying to make before about the past is not dead, it is not even past, is that for some people like Gavin, a lifetime of protecting themselves from the homophobic views of the broader community, you know, and a lifetime of that can be very taxing. And at this point, Gavin was caring for Richard at home and having to, you know, he didn't have a lot of energy and a lot of time to be able to be dealing with homophobia, in even inadvertent homophobia in the carers group. And so one of the recommendations is that we need to educate carers groups so they understand how incredibly important it is to be inclusive of everybody. Sorry, it's just stuck a little bit. Okay. And so then from Richard and Gavin and Richard again, they were talking to me about an application for guardianship that had been put in. And Gavin said, we're having a bit of a battle with one of Richard's relatives over power of attorney. The relative wrote to the guardianship tribunal in response to my application for guardian. She's very conservative and quite pious. Anyway, she wrote to the tribunal to oppose, not my health and welfare guardianship. She's quite happy for me to look after him, but the financial bit. So in her evidence, she said, I'm only grateful that my children are of an appropriate sexual orientation. When I spoke to Gavin in the interviews for this project, he was saying that he was given a copy of the letter by the guardianship board and that he lost days of sleep over reading a letter from Richard's cousin that discredited his sexuality and their relationship. And I think, again, we could look at this, you know, aside from their experiences dementia and say, well, he just needs to let that go. He just needs to get over it and get on with it. But actually, you know, a lifetime of, you know, not feeling safe, a lifetime of, you know, a number of the older people in same-sex relationships that I spoke to, they often knew as younger people that they were gay or lesbian, but also knew that it was considered to be a badness or a madness and repressed it. And often when they came out, you know, in their late teens or early 20s, lost a lot of family members, lost friends, lost employment. Some people were beaten up, you know, the worst experiences. And, you know, knowing that some people didn't have those experiences at all, but talking about the people that had trouble, what invariably happened that people told me about was that, you know, having these really tumultuous times and then meeting the love of their life, you know, as Gavin did with Richard, meeting someone that they loved, and for the first time in their lives, feeling affirmed and validated and understood in this intimate relationship. And we've written about this, you know, in a number of articles, that this was a safe space that needed to be protected. And so for Gavin and Richard, you know, then decades of being together, and even in a hostile homophobic world, having this space where you knew it was safe and you knew you could be affirmed and validated and celebrated. And then getting to a point where, because of Richard's dementia, they were needing to invite services into their own home and being worried whether or not those services would value them as a couple. And for Gavin and Richard, who may have made choices on a daily basis about whether they were going to disclose, about, you know, whether they were going to let people know they were a couple, whether they were not, all the way along. And then boom, service providers coming into their home, and their relationship then is being disclosed necessarily to service providers. And, you know, quite suddenly people are saying that, you know, my home and my relationship that was my safe place now no longer feels safe because I've got service providers coming in and I don't know whether they're going to be safe or not. And so this is a real challenge for people, LGBTI people with dementia. And then to have, you know, these other challenges as well too, that invariably when autonomy is reduced for people with dementia, if they have a homophobic or a transphobic family, the families will often, the research has shown us, will often step up and try to take control. And this is what happened to Gavin and Richard. And so it adds in an extra degree of difficulty. And then for Dale and Lillian, a lesbian couple who participated. Lillian had worked in aged care for a number of decades, and when she was diagnosed with dementia, had made Dale promise that she wouldn't let her go into a residential aged care home because she was worried about discrimination in the service. And so Dale was caring for her at home, she described, beyond her capacity to care for her at home because she was worried about discrimination in services. And Dale talked about the home care workers coming in, and one of the home care workers, she said, used to talk to me about people like you. And I didn't know what she was talking about at first. People like me, you mean intelligent or well-read? So finally I latched onto what she meant, the fact that I'm a lesbian. So again, you can say this is this low grade, feeling disrespected, you know, you could just get over that. But actually, I think given, you know, Dale and Lillian have the right to feel valued and affirmed and respected as clients of that service. And at that time when Dale was caring for Lillian beyond her physical capacity to do so, she was also managing what she felt was a disrespect from the service providers and also from family as well too. As Lillian's condition worsened, her children just wanted to be in control. The fact is they didn't give a fig, but they're all standing in line now waiting for the will to be read. the next thing I know, I'm summoned to the guardianship tribunal. So I lost control of access and accommodation for a year, and I lost control of Lillian's finances forever. So this was at a time for Dale when same-sex couples didn't have the same rights as heterosexual couples in Australia, and Lillian had previously been married, and her adult children did not approve of her mother leaving their father and then entering into a new relationship. And so this was some of the consequences for her that played out, you know, in this application for guardianship. That meant that Dale was having to deal with this as well, but not just that reflection on her relationship and the devaluing of her relationship, and implicit in that as well too is a devaluing of her sexuality. I think we might have someone with their
yeah, I've just unmuted them, muted them again, Catherine. I'm not sure why.
Thanks, Kate. So just to point out to you that if you go to alicesgarage.net, you'll see all of these resources are up on the website. And what we did as in the follow-up from that research is we developed a guide for with Dementia Australia for dementia inclusive services for LGBTI people. And there are two things that I want to point out here that are incredibly important. One of it we said was that for LGBTI people with dementia, documenting advanced care planning, powers of attorney would go a long way to resolving some of these issues. That if there was really clear relationships and roles, and also to people's preferences documented in advance, then that could be used to challenge families, because we're talking about family members who find they don't have a lot of energy for challenging LGBTI phobic family members. And so to document that advanced directive and planning could be incredibly important here. The other thing that I alluded to as well that I want to flag here as well too is what we refer to as posthumous abuse. And so this disrespecting of, in this case, same-sex relationships, and I'll talk in a minute also to disrespecting of gender identity, is not just something that happens while people with dementia are alive. It also happens after their death. And so we've documented a number of cases of in same-sex relationships where a person has died and their family take over, their biological family take over in the funeral arrangements, and a person's eulogy, in a person's eulogy, they're depicted as being heterosexual, and their same-sex, even long-term same-sex relationships are not acknowledged. And for trans and gender diverse people, how that plays out is that they can be, you know, if a person transitions to female, sometimes what families are doing is not acknowledging their female identity or their female name in their funeral services and on their tombstone. And so this is a disrespect that goes all the way through, which is incredibly crushing for family. What I want to do now is share with you some of the research that I've been involved in around trans and gender diverse people and dementia. I feel like for gay and lesbian folk and dementia, there is an understanding now that that gay and lesbian folk are still gay, are still lesbian after a diagnosis of dementia, and that is shifting and changing, but it's much more recalcitrant. This myth is much more recalcitrant for trans and gender diverse people. We see a lot of resources and narratives around trans and gender diverse people losing their gender identity when they develop dementia. And the narrative seems to be around gender identity as some kind of a superficial script that is just lost when a person has dementia. And this is presented as being the responses, if you like, of all trans and gender diverse people with dementia. And that is just, in our experience, of our research, that is simply not true. And I think is really problematic for two reasons. I think the first reason is that it's embedded in a transphobic view that that gender identity is not deeply embedded. That's the first thing that I want, you know, it's not a superficial script. And I think the other reason that it needs to be challenged is because the focus then on the trans or gender diverse person losing their gender identity takes the focus away from the biggest issue for trans and gender diverse people with dementia, and that is the disrespecting of gender identity by family members and service providers. So across the research that I've been involved in, perhaps 50 stories of trans and gender diverse people, there will, you know, I could tell you perhaps one, perhaps two stories where a trans or gender diverse person had difficulty maintaining their gender identity. But the remaining 40 plus stories where family members or service providers disrespected a person's gender identity. And that dynamic is exacerbated when a person has dementia and has a reduced capacity to assert their right to express their gender identity. So this is a real issue. And one of the things that we are noticing here across the board is that there is an increased number of people who are transitioning in residential aged care. I don't know entirely why that is the case, but it seems to be that some people are moving into residential aged care. It's the first time they've felt safe to transition. There may also be an aspect of people understanding that this is their last chance, if you like, to transition. And so in that space, and with increasing levels of dementia in residential aged care homes, it's incredibly important that we educate staff in residential aged care about supporting people who transition where there is a diagnosis of dementia as well too. And what we are noticing in the responses, there are some service providers who are doing this really well, and I'm going to share with you an example of that shortly. But there are also some service providers who have a very gender binary view of older people and people with dementia. And that is that you are either male or female and that you don't shift, that never shifts. The other view is that if, for example, a person transitions from male to female, that they ought to be female and exclusively female. And what we're hearing increasingly is that there are some people who are perhaps transitioning to female and going, well, I don't want to shave, and, you know, being told, well, no, this is what a woman looks like, this is what you need to do, and we need to help you do that. And so I think we've got a long way to go before we truly understand what gender diversity means in terms of service provision. And that's incredibly important because, as I'll share with you in a moment with Edna's story, for people who have dementia, it can be incredibly important that service providers or family members step up as advocates when they aren't able to assert their own rights. And my apologies, my little doggy has decided to play with the ball. I hope you can't hear that noise. So what I want to do is share with you now a couple of stories from the research that show some of the challenges and then an example of really fabulous care and service. So this is a story of Edna, who was in a residential aged care home, and it was from an interview with an aged care service provider. And the aged care service provider says, we had a new resident admitted as a male, and when one of the staff went to assist him, she noticed his anatomy was different. We found out he had transitioned in 1975 from male to female. His children were in their early teens at the time, and they were having problems adjusting still 40 years later. But what had happened was that Edna developed dementia and needed to go into a residential aged care home. And then the aged care service provider went on to explain, so the reason why this gentleman is living as a male here is because the son said, if you embarrass us and you don't dress like a man, you won't see any of your grandchildren. So that's why he's living here as a male. Not that the son brings his children in that much, but that threat was made. And so what this story does is it really emphasises two of the key problems. And one of the problems is that older trans and gender diverse people with dementia may find their gender expression restricted by family members. We know that from the research, and we know that for older trans and gender diverse people, there is an increasing trend to transitioning later in life, and that seems to be because it has not been safe for our current generations of older people to transition earlier on in life. A number of people, again, got married, lived the gender assigned at birth, and then in their later years are transitioning. And it can create significant issues in families where families are having difficulty adjusting to, for example, that somebody that they identified as their father is now transitioning to female. And that becomes a real flashpoint then if the person who is transitioning has dementia and has a reduced capacity to assert their rights with their family or with service providers. And so what we need in situations like this, we need elder rights, elder abuse services on board to advocate in these contexts, but we also need aged care service providers to understand their responsibility to advocate on behalf of trans and gender diverse people with dementia. And because I think when I read Edna's story, I wonder how many people read Edna's story and think, oh, Edna is presenting as male because she's got dementia and she's forgotten how to be female. But in fact, when you unpack it, what I see here is that Edna had transitioned 40 years earlier. She'd had surgery. She lived her life as female for 40 years, and her family was so incredibly important to her that when she was threatened with being cut off from her family, she made the decision to present as male rather than lose contact with the family, which she lost anyway. And I think there's a pivotal role here for service providers to come in and to mediate and to bring family in a way that the older trans and gender diverse person with dementia still has contact with family, but is able to be their authentic self. So it's not, the problem here is not that Edna forgot how to be female because she had dementia. That is not the problem here. The problem here is that Edna's family were transphobic and the service providers didn't understand how they could advocate on her behalf with family. So incredibly important issues here. We also interviewed Sam, and Sam's story with Hall and Pryor in WA won a Better Practice Award. So this story is in the public domain. And the service provider said when Sam came into our residential aged care facility around a year ago and transitioned a year after her admission, Sam told the lifestyle coordinator, I used to enjoy dressing as a female and was gay, but my family wasn't happy with it. Sam also has a nephew. He's her guardian, next to kin person. He responded to her transition by saying, it's just behaviour. She's doing this for attention. You shouldn't encourage this. He's only doing it for attention. So you can see the dilemma for service providers that when a person with dementia has reduced capacity, families stepping in and saying, no, this is not what you're going to do for our auntie. And in this case, beautiful story, the service providers stepped in and just negotiated with the family, tried to bring the family on board. They weren't on board. And so the service providers just said to the family, well, it's not your choice. This is Sam's choice, and this is the choice she has made, and we're supporting her in it. And so they did wonderful work. They educated the staff. They did some work with Sam and the other residents and with families. And, you know, I think that's a beautiful example of what the possibilities are. Just letting you know that we developed a series of resources as part of this Kinfolk project, which was on trans and gender diverse people's experiences of services. and they're on the Alice's Garage website. And probably the one that I really want to point out to you here is, if you see on the right side of the screen, one of the things that we said was we think it's incredibly important that care is from the heart. And what a number of older trans and gender diverse people said to us is they felt like they were in a circus. They felt like they were the circus, that service providers engaged with them in a way where they felt the service providers had a sort of a cognitive curiosity. You know, I've never met a trans or gender diverse person before. You know, this is so exciting. I get to meet one. And that kind of cognitive curiosity was coming across as a little bit over curious, a little bit invasive, and not compassionate enough. And what trans and gender diverse people were saying to us is, we want compassionate care. We want you to care for us from the heart. We want you to see us as human beings. And then when a person has dementia, when they're experiencing those real challenges with family or other service providers or other clients or residents or the community, the compassionate service providers are able to intervene in a way that's incredibly helpful. So the final project that I wanted to talk to you about today is the kindness pandemic, and to talk to you about what that means for people with dementia and their families. But just to give you a little bit of a background on the kindness pandemic, I set up the kindness pandemic a year ago. So on the 14th of March 2020, and it was really around my own anxiety at COVID, and also listening to the news, and in the Northern Hemisphere, in the UK and in Europe in particular, you were 6 months ahead of us in terms of the virus, and I was watching what was happening for older people in Europe, and the high mortality and morbidity for older people, and the ageist discourses around COVID. And because of all of that, just thinking we need to live in a kinder world. And so I thought, well, you know, that saying, where energy grows, where energy goes, attention flows. And so I thought, well, if we focus in on kindness, maybe this will help us to get through COVID-19. So I started off with a focus on intergenerational kindness, saying, you know, let's bring older and younger people together and let's focus on supporting each other and not be doing this ageist discourse. But I realized actually after a while, it wasn't intergenerational. It's really about intersectional kindness. And what I mean by that is kindness for everybody, and particularly kindness for people who were doing it tough before COVID. So that can be people with dementia, and people who are doing it tough because of COVID. And so I set up the kindness pandemic. I set it up as a Facebook group. It grew by 1,000 people overnight, and then over 500,000 in 2 weeks' time. And Facebook tell us it was one of the fastest growing Facebook groups in the world. It was growing at about 50,000 people a day for a considerable period of time. And we now still have, a year down the track, we still have 550,000 people. We've had for the last year 26 million reactions. And what we do is we have a campaign every couple of weeks focusing on a particular group of people, just as a way of trying to share stories in our group. And the group responds really beautifully well to first-person narratives. And so what we've been doing is exploring with them some of the work that we might do, sharing the experiences of people with dementia as a way of building an understanding of dementia and destigmatizing dementia in particular, and also promoting acts of kindness for people with dementia, letting people know how incredibly important it is. So the first campaign that we set up is a beautiful campaign called Two Good Men. And this is John Quinn on the left, who is here with us today. And I want to also acknowledge the very beautiful Kieran Glennon on the right in the checkered shirt as well too, Emily. You are both very beautiful human beings. And so John and Kieran's campaign, the two good men campaign, was really around them saying, you know, we were both in our 50s, we were both husbands, parents and school principals when we were diagnosed with dementia, and we had to rethink our whole world. But it was the kindness of family and friends and community that's really got us through. And so John and Kieran's campaign comes with these key points, which is, the key points are: dementia is nothing to be ashamed of. You can live well with dementia. And then the next point's hidden from me, but you can all read it. Dementia affects all aspects of a person's life. It's not just memory loss. People with dementia and their families can't do it alone. We need your help. And acts of kindness can transform the lives of people with dementia. So they are their key messages. And what we've done a couple of posts and they've been really well received by our group. But what we're looking at doing now is exploring the possibility of John posting one week and Kieran the next week, so that each week there's a post by a person with dementia talking about an everyday act of kindness that transformed their life, or something they did for someone else as well too. And it's a really lovely way of educating over 500,000 people about what dementia is and what it isn't. But what I want to also acknowledge with John and Kieran, we've been working together for probably about 2 years now. And John and Kieran have some incredibly important messages around dementia and masculinity, and how a diagnosis of dementia impacted on the way they saw themselves as men, and how that had to be, or how they renegotiated that, and how they live now as men. And so we've been doing some work on that for the Museum of Love, and there will be an educational resource and quite a beautiful long film, 45-minute film, that will be launched later on this year. But when COVID-19 hit, one of the things that was happening for us here in Australia, perhaps around the world, is as we went into lockdown, stats started to emerge about increased rates of family violence. And one of the things that we were having conversations about was the need to send a message in particular to men about what I call masculine plasticity, around John and Kieran's message that you can have a major change in your life and rethink who you are as men and come out of it a better person, or with a really strong sense of yourself as a man. So what we did was we took the film footage that we already had, and we pulled out a 7-minute film with the support of Drummond Street Services, a 7-minute film in which John and Kieran have this beautiful banter around changing the perception of who they are as men, about having a crisis point in their lives where they rethought who they are as men and what being a good man means to them now. And it is such a powerful film. You can see it on the Kindness Pandemic website under their Two Good Men campaign. But in that first day that we shared it, in the Kindness Pandemic, they got 3,000 views, and it was just a really beautiful response to it. So that's our first campaign, and I'm incredibly grateful to John and Kieran, and also to Karen and Glennis, their wives, for working together on this incredibly important project. The other one that is up but we haven't done much with yet is a project called Stella Kindness. And this is Stella and Mandy. And when Mandy was growing up, Stella is her auntie, and Stella did a lot of mothering for Mandy when she was growing up and nurtured Mandy through food. And Mandy left Australia to, go off and live for a decade in the Amazon, I think. And when Stella was diagnosed with dementia, Mandy came home to live with Stella and to support her. And one of the things SBS picked up on this story, that there's this beautiful thing that Stella and Mandy do together, nurturing each other through food. And so one of the things that we have invited Mandy to do is to do regular posts in our group, sharing her cooking with her auntie, and, you know, sharing food and sharing recipes as a way of engaging our group members into understanding their story and the importance of interconnection and supporting people with dementia. So watch this space for more fabulous Greek recipes. And that's it for me. I promised that I would give you plenty of time for discussion. But all of the resources are all in this presentation. All the links are there, so you can follow up with any of those. And you're also welcome to contact me as well.